Off the southern coast of Sicily, in the summer of 256 BC, something happened on the water that has almost no equal in the history of the world, and that you have probably never heard of. Nearly 700 warships came together in a single battle. On their decks and at their oars were close to 300,000 men. To put that number where you can feel it, that is more human beings fighting in one battle than at Trafalgar, at Lepanto, and at Salamis combined. It is, by the count of men who fought, very possibly the largest naval battle ever fought in all of history, before or since. And almost no one remembers its name. There is no famous painting of it, no admiral whose statue you would recognize. It does not appear in the movies. If you asked 100 people to name the biggest sea battle in history, not one of them would say Ecnomus, because they have never heard the word. That is the first strange thing about this battle. The second is who won it, because one of the two fleets that met off Cape Ecnomus belonged to Carthage, the greatest naval power in the world, a nation of sailors who had ruled the western Mediterranean for centuries. And the other belonged to Rome, a land power, a nation of farmers and soldiers that a few years earlier had not possessed a navy at all, had never fought a battle at sea, did not, in any real sense, know how. This is the story of how the most powerful navy on earth was beaten by a people who had to invent seamanship from nothing, and of the single ingenious, ridiculous-looking device that let them do it. And it is the story of how that same device a few years later would drown more Romans than Carthage ever managed to kill. If you want more naval history told this way, subscribing helps us keep making it. To understand how Rome ended up fighting the largest naval battle in history, you have to understand that Rome never wanted a navy in the first place. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, there were two great powers in the western Mediterranean, and they had spent generations not quite touching each other. One was Rome, which had spent those generations conquering the Italian peninsula the hard way, on foot, legion by legion. Rome was a land animal. Its whole way of war, its whole identity, was built around heavy infantry, disciplined citizen soldiers who won wars by marching at the enemy and grinding him down in close combat. Rome did not do ships. The other power was Carthage, a great trading city on the coast of North Africa, near modern Tunis. Carthage was everything Rome was not. It was old, rich, cosmopolitan, and above all, it was a sea power. Its wealth came from trade across the whole western Mediterranean, and its navy existed to protect that trade, and that navy was simply the best in the world. Carthaginian sailors had been handling warships for centuries. Their captains could read wind and water the way a Roman centurion could read a battlefield. On the sea, Carthage did not really have rivals. It had prey. For a long time, these two powers had no reason to collide. And then they collided over Sicily. Sicily is the large island at the toe of Italy, and it sat exactly between the two powers, and in 264 BC, a local dispute there dragged both Rome and Carthage in, and neither could back down, and the result was a war that would last 23 years and become, by the reckoning of the ancient world, the longest and one of the bloodiest wars anyone had ever fought. We call it the First Punic War, Punic being the Roman word for the Carthaginians. And Rome very quickly ran into a wall. It could fight in Sicily. Its legions were as good as ever. But Sicily is an island, and everything on an island depends on the sea around it, and the sea around it belonged to Carthage. As long as the Carthaginian navy could sail wherever it wanted, supply its cities, raid the Italian coast, land troops anywhere, cut Rome's forces off from resupply, Rome could not win. It could march to the water's edge and no further. The war would grind on forever, on Carthaginian terms, decided by a navy Rome could not match. The Romans looked at this problem and reached a conclusion that was, frankly, insane. If they could not win without a navy, they would build one, from nothing, in a single year. The story of how they did it is one of the most Roman stories there is, and while parts of it may have grown in the telling, the core of it is almost certainly true. Rome had no tradition of building large warships. The standard warship of the age was the quinquereme, a big galley rowed by around 300 men pulling oars in a carefully coordinated arrangement, a genuinely sophisticated piece of engineering. The Romans had never built one, so, according to the tradition, when a Carthaginian warship ran aground and was captured early in the war, the Romans took it apart, studied it, used it as a template, and built a fleet by copying the enemy. Over 100 warships in about 2 months, if the sources are to be believed. But building the ships was the easy part. A warship is a machine, and you can copy a machine. What you cannot copy is 100 years of seamanship. The Romans could build quanqueremes. They could not, in a single year, learn to fight them the way the Carthaginians did. The ramming, the maneuvering, the delicate art of using your ship itself as a weapon, driving your bronze-sheathed prow into the enemy's hull at exactly the right angle and speed. That skill takes a generation. The Romans did not have a generation. They had a war. So they did something brilliant. Instead of trying to beat the Carthaginians at the game the Carthaginians had spent centuries mastering, they changed the game. The Romans knew what they were good at. They were the finest close-quarters infantry in the world. A Roman legionary, sword to sword on solid footing, would beat a Carthaginian sailor almost every time. The problem was simply getting them together, because at sea, the Carthaginians would never let a Roman ship close enough to board. They would dance away, circle, ram, and sink the clumsy Roman vessels before a single legionary could set foot on an enemy deck. The Roman answer was a device, and it was so simple it looks almost like a joke. They called it the corvus, the Latin word for a crow or a raven, because of what it looked like and what it did. The corvus was a boarding bridge, a heavy wooden gangway, something like 4 feet wide and 36 feet long, mounted on a pivot at the bow of the ship so it could swing out to either side. And at the far end of it was a great iron spike, shaped like a beak, which is where the name came from. The bridge was held upright until the moment of contact. Then, when an enemy ship came within reach, the Romans dropped it. The heavy beak came smashing down onto the enemy's deck and drove into the timber, spiking the two ships together, locking them in place so the enemy could not pull away. And then the corvus became exactly what it was designed to be: a bridge, a road. The Roman legionaries, who a moment before had been useless passengers on a clumsy ship, now had a solid path straight onto the enemy's deck, and they poured across it, sword and shield, and turned a sea battle into a land battle fought on wooden platforms, which was the one kind of fight in the world the Romans could not lose. The genius of it was not just mechanical, it was psychological. For centuries, Carthaginian crews had gone into battle certain of their superiority, secure in the knowledge that no clumsy landlubber could ever catch them on the open water. Now, suddenly, the moment they closed to attack, an iron beak would crash down onto their deck, and a wall of armored Roman soldiers would come storming across. Everything that had made them masters of the sea, their speed, their skill, their maneuver, was canceled by a wooden plank. It must have felt like the sea itself had betrayed them. Rome tested the corvus in a smaller battle at a place called Mylae in 260 BC, and it worked. The Carthaginians, sailing inconfident and contemptuous, were spiked and boarded and beaten, and Rome won its first naval victory in its history. The Roman commander was given a triumph, and a monument decorated with the prows of the captured ships was raised in the Forum. And that victory gave Rome an idea so ambitious it took Carthage completely by surprise. If Rome could win at sea, then Rome did not have to keep fighting the endless war in Sicily at all. It could take the war to Carthage itself. It could load an army onto its new fleet, sail across the sea to Africa, and threaten the great city directly. That was the plan in 256 BC. And it is why the largest naval battle in history was about to be fought, because the entire Roman invasion force had to get past the Carthaginian navy to reach Africa, and the Carthaginian navy had every intention of stopping it. The numbers that came together off Cape Ecnomus that summer are, even allowing for ancient exaggeration, staggering. The Romans, according to our main source, the Greek historian Polybius, writing about a century later and generally regarded as careful, brought around 330 warships. Aboard them, counting rowers, sailors, and the soldiers of the invasion army they were carrying to Africa, something close to 140,000 men. The Carthaginians came out to meet them with around 350 ships of their own, carrying perhaps 150,000 men. Put those together, and you get close to 700 warships and something approaching 300,000 human beings, gathered to fight in the water off one stretch of the Sicilian coast on a single day. A word of honesty here, because this channel does not pretend the ancient numbers are gospel. Almost everything we know about this battle comes from one man, Polybius, a Greek historian writing about a century later, who had access to Roman records and probably to Carthaginian sources as well, and who is generally regarded as one of the most careful historians of the ancient world. But even a careful historian, writing 100 years after the fact about a war fought before he was born, can inherit inflated figures, and some modern scholars think these totals are too high. What the historians do not really dispute is the scale. Whatever the exact count, Ecnomus stands with the very largest naval engagements ever fought, and by the number of men involved, it is quite possibly at the very top of the list. When you next hear Trafalgar or Salamis called a great sea battle, remember that by head count, this forgotten fight off Sicily may have dwarfed them both. The Carthaginians, the master sailors, had a plan built around their one great advantage, their superior seamanship. They intended to use their speed and skill to outmaneuver the Romans, to get around the flanks and the rear of the Roman fleet, to turn the battle into the kind of flowing, maneuvering fight where their captain's skill would tell and the corvus would be useless, because you cannot spike a ship you cannot catch. The Romans knew their weakness and built their formation around protecting it. Polybius describes an unusual arrangement in 4 squadrons. The 2 leading squadrons, each headed by one of the year's consuls, Regulus and Vulso, in their heavy flagships, angled back from a single point to form the 2 sides of a great wedge, a floating triangle driving forward. Behind them came a 3rd squadron, towing the transport ships that carried the horses and supplies of the invasion army. And a 4th squadron came last, spread in a line across the rear, guarding the back of the whole formation. It was compact, flexible, and built for one purpose, to keep the fleet from being pulled apart and picked off, which was exactly what the Carthaginians intended to do. When the fleets met, the battle did what enormous battles tend to do. It broke apart into pieces, and it broke apart because the Carthaginians made it happen on purpose. Their center, under a commander named Hamilcar, not the famous Hamilcar Barca, father of Hannibal, but another man of the same name, deliberately fell back, retreating before the Roman point, tempting the 2 consular squadrons to charge forward and chase. The Romans took the bait and pursued, and as they did, the front of the Roman wedge pulled away from the rear squadrons still guarding the transports. Then, at a signal from Hamilcar's own ship, the retreating Carthaginians turned as one and fell on their pursuers, while the Carthaginian wings swept in on the separated Roman 3rd and 4th squadrons. The single vast engagement became 3 separate battles fought at once across miles of water. For a long, confused, brutal day, it hung in the balance. The Roman rear squadron, guarding the transports, was driven back against the shore and hard-pressed. Another Roman division was in trouble on the flank. For a while, the Carthaginian plan seemed to be working. The Roman fleet pulled apart into separate struggling knots. But everywhere the ships actually came together, the same thing happened over and over, and it decided the battle. The corvus fell. The beak bit into Carthaginian timber. The legionaries stormed across, and a Carthaginian crew that had come to ram and maneuver found itself instead in a hand-to-hand infantry fight against the best close-quarters soldiers in the world, a fight it had no way to win. Ship after ship was spiked, boarded, and taken. And crucially, the Carthaginians grew afraid to close. They saw what happened to any ship that came within reach of a Roman prow, and they began to hesitate, to hold back, and a sailor who is afraid to close cannot ram, and a Carthaginian who cannot ram has lost his only weapon. The very skill that was supposed to win the battle was neutralized by fear of the plank. Regulus, at the point of the wedge, having broken through the giving Carthaginian center, was able to turn his ships around and bring them back to relieve the hard-pressed Roman squadrons at the rear and on the flank. The Carthaginian plan came apart. Their fleet began to break. By the end of the day, the greatest navy in the world had been shattered by the people who, a few years earlier, had not owned a ship. The Carthaginians lost around 30 ships sunk and more than 60 captured, close to 100 vessels gone, and the crews aboard the captured ships taken prisoner. The Romans lost around 24 ships sunk and not one captured. It was not close. It was a massacre, and it was inflicted by the landlubbers, with their ridiculous plank on the masters of the sea. The road to Africa lay open, and here, at the moment of Rome's greatest triumph at sea, the story turns, and the same device that had just won the largest naval battle in history begins to take its revenge. The Roman invasion went ahead. The army crossed to Africa, landed, and at first it went brilliantly. Regulus, left in command, ravaged the Carthaginian countryside, won a crushing victory, and brought Carthage to the very edge of surrender. The great city sued for peace. And then Regulus overplayed it. Certain he had won, he demanded terms so harsh, so humiliating, that Carthage decided it would rather fight to the death than accept them. In their desperation, the Carthaginians hired a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus to rebuild and retrain their army. And Xanthippus was very good. He lured Regulus, the conqueror, onto open ground where Carthage's cavalry and its war elephants could be used, and there he destroyed the Roman army utterly. Of a force of over 15,000 men, around 2,000 survived. Regulus himself was captured, and according to Roman tradition, he was eventually tortured to death. The invasion that Ecnomus had made possible ended in catastrophe. And then came the sea, and the corvus took its real price. Rome sent a fleet to Africa to evacuate the survivors of the disaster. It fought yet another naval battle on the way, and won again. The corvus was still deadly in a fight. But in the summer of 255 BC, on the voyage home, that victorious fleet was caught in a storm off the southern coast of Sicily, near a town called Camarina. And what happened next was the worst maritime disaster in the history of the ancient world, and possibly the greatest single loss of life in a shipwreck ever recorded, anywhere, to this day. And it did not have to happen. According to Polybius, the Roman commanders had been warned. Experienced pilots told them not to sail the exposed southern coast in that season in those waters. The commanders ignored them. Polybius blames a very Roman arrogance, a refusal to bend even to the sea itself, and sailed on into the teeth of it. The fleet was nearly annihilated. Of a total of 464 ships, 384 were sunk or smashed to pieces on the rocks. Only about 80 survived to limp into Syracuse. The dead, rowers, sailors, soldiers, the very men who had just been rescued from Africa, numbered by the ancient accounts in the neighborhood of 100,000. In a single storm, Rome lost more men than in any battle of the entire war. More men, quite possibly, than had died in the vast fight at Ecnomus itself. Polybius called it the greatest disaster at sea he knew of, and modern historians have called it the greatest single loss of life in any shipwreck in the history of seafaring. And here is the bitter heart of it. Many historians, ancient and modern, believe the corvus was partly to blame. That heavy boarding bridge mounted high on the bow made the Roman ships top-heavy and unstable, clumsy in rough water, slow to answer the helm, prone to capsizing in exactly the kind of storm that caught them off Sicily. The device that let the Romans turn the sea into a battlefield they could win had also turned their ships into things that did not sit well on the sea at all. In calm water, closing to board, the corvus was a war winner. In a gale, it may have been a death sentence. Rome, which had lost tens of thousands of men to the weather, seems to have learned the lesson. After these disasters, the corvus quietly disappears from the record. The Romans stopped using it. And the reason is the whole story of the First Punic War in miniature, because by then Rome no longer needed it. That is the part that should genuinely impress you. Rome had started this war unable to sail. It had won by cheating, essentially, by refusing to fight a real naval battle and inventing a gadget that turned sea fights into land fights. But you cannot man hundreds of ships and fight years of battles and cross the sea again and again without, somewhere in all that, actually learning to sail. Slowly, battle by battle, disaster by disaster, the Roman crews became real sailors. And when at last they had learned enough, they set the training wheels aside. They dropped the corvus, built lighter and faster ships, and near the very end of the war, in 241 BC, off the Aegates Islands, a Roman fleet met the Carthaginians and beat them at last in a straight sea fight. No plank, no trick, just Roman ships handled by Roman sailors who had, finally, become the thing they once could only imitate. That victory ended the war. Rome had won. The consequences are difficult to overstate. The First Punic War broke Carthage's grip on the western Mediterranean and made Rome, for the first time, a sea power as well as a land power. It set the two cities on the road to the even greater war that was coming, the one with Hannibal and his elephants, a generation later. And in the longest view, it was the first step by which a farming republic in central Italy began to become the empire that would rule the whole Mediterranean world. That whole story starts here, with a people who could not sail deciding to build a fleet anyway. And at the center of it sits this enormous, forgotten battle. Nearly 700 ships, 300,000 men, the greatest navy in the world, humbled by amateurs with an iron beak. Quite possibly the largest naval battle ever fought by any people in any age. And it has no famous painting, no monument you have seen, no place in the popular memory at all. Just a name most people have never heard, attached to a stretch of Sicilian water where, for one day, more men fought at sea than ever had before, or arguably ever would again. The next one on this channel is another battle where a smaller, cleverer fleet undid a proud enemy in narrow water. Svolder in the year 1000, where a Viking king who thought he could not be beaten sailed into a trap set by everyone he had ever wronged.